They thought he was just another quiet kid lost in his own world. But when his teacher put him on the spot, challenging him in front of the entire class, no one expected what happened next. Laughter turned to silence. Doubt turned to shock. And in a single moment, a boy who had spent his whole life blending and did something that made the whole room stop and stare. This is the story of Elijah Walker, the math prodigy no one saw coming. The midday sun cast golden streaks across the polished floors of Oak Ridge Middle School. It was early autumn in Atlanta, Georgia, and the classroom buzzed with restless energy as students settled into their 8th grade math class. In the back row near the window, Elijah Walker, a quiet 13-year-old black boy, took his usual seat. His brown eyes, sharp yet distant, drifted toward the world outside, watching the wind ripple through the trees as if it held the answers to something far greater than the lesson ahead. Elijah wasn't inattentive, at least, not in the way most people assumed. Numbers fascinated him. Patterns made sense in a way people never did, but the slow, repetitive drills of classroom math bored him to no end. While his classmates stumbled over simple equations, he had already solved problems far beyond their level, scribbled in the margins of his notebook. But he never spoke up, never raised his hand, never showed what he could do because in his experience, standing out only made you a target. At the front of the room, Angela Whitmore adjusted the sleeves of her fitted blazer, her sharp eyes scanning the class as they took their seats. A veteran teacher with little patience for laziness, she prided herself on pushing her students to their full potential. Today, however, her patience was running thin. The most recent test results sat on her desk, a neat stack of papers marked with red ink, and the sight of so many low scores left her questioning whether these kids were even trying. As she called out names and handed back tests, she offered brief comments, good work to some, you need to study more to others. But when she reached Elijah's desk, she hesitated. His test sat on top, marked with a flawless 100%, circled in red. It wasn't the first time, but something about the way he sat there silent, uninterested, barely acknowledging the paper irked her. All right, listen up, Ms. Whitmore's voice cut through the chatter, silencing the room. Most of you did okay on this test, her tone suggested otherwise, but a lot of you are still struggling with concepts we've been covering for weeks. Elijah barely listened, his chin resting on his hand as his gaze drifted back to the window. The rustling leaves outside held more of his attention than Ms. Whitmore's lecture until his name snapped through the air like a whip. Elijah Walker. His body jolted upright, his heart racing as every head in the room turned toward him. Heat rushed to his cheeks, his fingers clenching the edge of his desk. Yes, Mom, he mumbled. You seem very interested in what's happening outside, Ms. Whitmore said, her voice laced with thinly veiled irritation. Care to share what's so fascinating? A few muffled chuckles rippled through the class. Elijah swallowed, unsure of how to respond. Ms. Whitmore wasn't smiling. Let's see if you've been paying attention, she continued. Come up here. The room fell into complete silence as Elijah froze. His chair scraped against the floor as he pushed himself up slowly, feeling the weight of every single stare drilling into his back. His palms were sweaty, his heart pounded in his chest, and he could hear whispers behind him. Oh man, she's about to roast him, someone muttered. He never talks. Another added with a laugh, that he doesn't even know what's going on. Elijah heard them all. He could feel the smirks, the eyes waiting for him to fail, to make a fool of himself. But what none of them knew, not his classmates, not Miss Whitmore, was that this moment was about to change everything. She stepped aside, gesturing to the whiteboard where she had written an equation that was far beyond their grade level. Elijah's stomach twisted. He knew what this was, a test, a public trial, a moment designed to put him on the spot. Ms. Whitmore wasn't just calling him out. She was challenging him. Go ahead, she said, offering him the marker, her tone almost daring. Elijah's fingers curled around the marker, the cool plastic pressing into his palm. He stared at the board, his mind racing, and the whispers behind him felt louder, the pressure heavier. For a moment, he considered handing back the marker and walking away. But then something shifted. A small voice inside reminded him of all the hours he had spent solving equations like this in his notebook for no one but himself. The world outside the window had always been a distraction, an escape, but math was his language, his rhythm, his way of making sense of everything. This wasn't about proving anything to them. This was about proving it to himself. Elijah took a deep breath, raised the marker to the board, and began to write. The room seemed to shrink as he focused, his mind cutting through the problem with a clarity he knew none of them expected. The first strokes were careful, testing the waters, but as he moved from one step to the next, his hand grew steadier. The laughter faded. The whisper stopped. Behind him, Ms. Whitmore's arms slowly uncrossed. "Wait, is he actually doing it?" A girl in the second row whispered. "Looks like it," her friend replied, leaning forward, eyes wide. Elijah worked methodically, breaking the problem down into smaller pieces, isolating variables, simplifying fractions. His mind moved faster now, his marker gliding across the board with absolute certainty. The only sound in the room was a soft squeak of ink meeting the whiteboard. The class wasn't laughing anymore. Even the boy who had mocked him earlier sat stiffly in his chair, his mouth slightly open. Miss Whitmore took a step forward, her sharp gaze scanning each line of his solution. She had expected hesitation. She had expected a mistake. But there was none. Elijah wasn't just solving the problem. He was dismantling it, step by step, breaking it down with a level of understanding that went far beyond the textbook. Finally, with a final stroke, he circled his answer and capped the marker with a satisfying click. Then he turned around, facing the room. For a long moment, nobody said a word. The whiteboard behind him was filled with perfectly organized equations, each step leading seamlessly to the correct answer. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed in the silence. Elijah scanned the faces of his classmates, now filled with wide eyes and slack jaws. Even the students who never paid him any attention were staring at him with something different now. Respect. Miss Whitmore stepped forward, heels clicking softly against the floor. She studied the board closely, her finger tracing each step of his work, her lips moving silently as she double-checked every line. Finally, she turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable. Then finally she spoke. "This," she said, her voice softer now. A pause. "This is correct." The class erupted. A ripple of disbelief spread through the room, followed by a few tentative claps. The applause grew louder, filling the space as more students joined in. Elijah stood there, unsure of how to react. His cheeks burned, but this time, it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from something new. Something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Pride. The clapping rippled through the room, uneven at first, then growing louder as more students joined in. Elijah stood frozen, his fingers still gripping the marker, his pulse thudding in his ears. He had expected whispers, maybe even some smirks, but applause. That was something he had never prepared for. Miss Whitmore held up a hand, and the room fell quiet again, though the energy was different now. She turned back to the board, scanning each line of Elijah's solution with a sharp, calculating gaze. He braced himself for criticism for some technicality she'd used to discredit him, but instead she nodded once and said, "This is beyond impressive." A murmur spread across the classroom, students exchanging glances filled with newfound curiosity. The same kids who had laughed moments ago were now leaning forward, looking at him differently. Elijah had spent so long avoiding attention, blending into the background, that the sudden shift felt overwhelming. He wasn't sure how to react. "Miss..." Whitmore turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Elijah," she said, her voice measured, "why have you been sitting in the back of my classroom like you don't belong here?" He hesitated, his fingers flexing around the cap marker. He had no answer, at least not one he was ready to say out loud. For years, he had made himself small on purpose. Being quiet kept people from expecting things, from asking questions, from looking too closely. But now after this, there was no going back to invisibility. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest. But before he could speak, another voice broke the silence. "Yo, Walker, where did that come from?" One of the boys in the back called out, his tone laced with genuine curiosity. "For real?" Another added, "You've been hiding this the whole time." Elijah swallowed, shifting on his feet, feeling the heat of their stares. I just like math," he finally said, his voice quieter than he intended. Some students nodded, impressed, while others still looked at him like he was a puzzle they had yet to solve. But no one was laughing anymore. Miss Whitmore tilted her head, still studying him. "Liking math is one thing," she said, "but this takes something more." She let the words hang in the air, giving him time to process their weight. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible smile, she said, "We need to talk after class." Elijah's stomach twisted at those words. Was he in trouble? Was this a setup for something else? He had spent so long avoiding extra attention, and now it was coming for him full force. He nodded stiffly, then turned back toward his seat. As he walked past the rows of desks, the shift in the air was undeniable. Some students offered nods, others still whispered amongst themselves, but the mockery was gone. He slid back into his seat, his hands pressed flat against his desk, and let out a slow breath. For the first time ever, people saw him. The rest of the class passed in a blur. Miss Whitmore continued the lesson, but the energy in the room had changed. Every so often, Elijah could feel eyes drifting toward him, as if they were still trying to process what they had just witnessed. Even the usual troublemakers were silent, their attention flickering back to the board, as if something important had just shifted. When the bell rang, students gathered their things, but a few hesitated near his desk. "That was dope, man," a girl said, stuffing books into her bag. "You gotta teach me how you did that." Elijah blinked, caught off guard by the request. Yeah, sure." Another boy, usually one of the loudest in class, gave him a nod of approval before walking out. This was all new territory. He had never been the one people turned to for help, never been the center of interest. As the room cleared, Ms. Whitmore gestured for him to stay back. He gathered his notebook, gripping it like an anchor, before walking toward her desk. The classroom felt larger now, as if something had expanded within its walls. Ms. Whitmore leaned against her desk, her arms crossed, her usual stern expression softened just slightly. "Elijah," she said, her tone different than before. "I owe you an apology." His head snapped up, his fingers tightening around the notebook. An apology. From her. He had expected a lecture, a rep zoning out, but not this. She sighed, shaking her head. "I've been teaching for a long time, and I like to think I can spot potential when I see it," she said. "But with you, I got it wrong. I assumed your quietness meant you weren't paying attention, that you didn't care." She met his eyes directly, and for once he didn't look away. "You care," she continued. "That much is obvious. You just don't let people see it." Elijah swallowed, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to adults noticing him in this way. After a pause, Miss Whitmore pulled a folder from her desk and slid it toward him. "There's an advanced math program at the district level," she said. "It's designed for students who need more of a challenge. I think you'd be a perfect fit." Elijah stared at the folder, his pulse quickening. An advanced class. The idea both thrilled and terrified him. Could he do this? Could he step into something bigger than his quiet world in the back of a classroom? "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I mess up?" Miss Whitmore's expression softened. "Messing up is part of learning," she said, "but if you don't try, you'll never know what you're capable of." Elijah looked down at the folder, then back up at her. There was something in her expression that he hadn't seen before belief. Someone finally believed in him. He exhaled slowly, nodding. "Okay," he said, "I'll do it." A small smile crossed her face. "Good," she said. "This is just the beginning, Elijah. Remember that." As he left the classroom, the folder tucked securely under his arm, something felt different. The hallway, the students passing by, even the weight of his own footsteps, everything felt lighter. He didn't know exactly where this path would lead, but for the first time, he was ready to follow it. Elijah walked down the hallway, the folder clutched tightly under his arm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, lockers slammed shut, and voices filled the space, but it all felt distant. His mind kept circling back to Ms. Whitmore's words. The way she had looked at him, not with frustration, not with disappointment, but with belief. It was a feeling so unfamiliar that he wasn't sure what to do with it. He had spent years making himself invisible, convinced that blending in was safer than standing out. But now, there was no going back. The class had seen what he could do. The world had shifted. He could still hear the way they had clapped, the way their whispers had changed from mockery to curiosity. And now there was a question pressing at the back of his mind. What if I really do belong somewhere bigger than this? That evening, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the folder Ms. Whitmore had given him. His mom, Vanessa Walker, moved around the kitchen, the smell of baked chicken filling the air, but she kept glancing at him. Finally, she wiped her hands on a towel and sat across from him. "You've been quiet since you got home," she said. "What's on your mind?" Elijah hesitated, fingers tracing the edge of the folder. "My teacher gave me this today," he said, pushing it toward her. "It's an advanced math program she thinks I should join." Vanessa picked up the folder, flipping through the pages, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up, her eyes filled with something Elijah couldn't quite place. "Are you interested?" she asked. He swallowed, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's different. And it's after school twice a week. I don't know if I can do it." Vanessa set the folder down, her gaze steady. "Elijah," she said, her voice softer now. Do you remember when you were little, how you used to count everything? The tiles on the floor, the stars in the sky, even how many steps it took to get from the car to the front door. Elijah blinked, caught off guard. Yeah. You've always had a gift, she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. I've seen it for years. But you've kept it to yourself, maybe because you were scared of what people would think. Now the world is seeing what I've known all along. You are meant for more. Elijah's chest tightened. He had spent so long convincing himself that his abilities didn't matter, that they weren't worth showing. But here was his mother looking at him with nothing but pride. He took a deep breath. Okay, he said, his voice firmer this time. I'll do it. A slow smile spread across Vanessa's face. That's my boy, she said. And whatever happens, just remember you belong there. The next week, Elijah attended his first session of the advanced math program. The room was filled with students from different schools, some whispering excitedly, others scribbling notes before the lesson even started. This was nothing like his regular classroom here. The energy was different. Everyone wanted to be here. As the instructor, Professor Nolan, introduced himself, Elijah felt the weight of doubt creep in. Was he really good enough for this? But then the first problem appeared on the board, a challenge far tougher than anything he had seen in class. And as his pencil hit the paper, something clicked. Numbers had always made sense to him, but here, surrounded by people who actually loved math as much as he did, it felt right. The minutes passed quickly, equations stacking up on his paper as he lost himself in the rhythm. By the time Professor Nolan called time, Elijah looked up, realizing he had solved every single problem. A student next to him, a girl with glasses and tight curls, glanced at his paper. Dude, she said, eyes wide. You finished all of them. Elijah hesitated, nodding. She let out a low whistle. I struggled with the last two, she admitted. You gotta teach me your tricks. Elijah felt his stomach flip. Someone wanted him to teach them? He had spent so long thinking of himself as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. But maybe he did. Over the next few weeks, Elijah's world began to shift. In his regular class, students started asking for his help, no longer mocking him, but respecting him. At home, his mother beamed every time he came home talking about something new he had learned. And in the advanced class, he found himself thriving, engaging in discussions, challenging himself, and loving every second of it. One afternoon, Mims Whitmore pulled him aside after class. I saw your latest scores from the program, she said, holding up a paper with a 98% circled at the top. Your professor is impressed. Elijah felt something warm spread through his chest. Thanks, he said, his voice lighter than usual. Ms. Whitmore studied him for a moment before speaking again. I started this year thinking you were just another kid who didn't care, she admitted. Turns out, I was completely wrong. She offered him a rare, genuine smile. I'm glad you let us see who you really are, Elijah. For the first time, he smiled back. Me too. As he walked out of the classroom, the way he had carried for years felt lighter. He no longer felt the need to hide. He no longer needed to blend in. He was done being invisible, because now the world finally saw him. And he was just getting started. People will judge you before they know you. They'll assume you're just another face in the crowd, just another quiet kid, just another person who doesn't stand out. And if you let them define you, you'll stay in the shadows forever. But here's the truth, your potential doesn't disappear just because others don't see it. Elijah Walker didn't ask for the spotlight, but when the moment came, he didn't run from it, he owned it. He could have stayed silent, let them believe he was ordinary. But instead, he showed the world exactly who he was. And in doing so, he changed how people saw him forever. How many times have you held yourself back because you were afraid of what others might think? How often have you let doubt silence your abilities? The moment you stop hiding, the moment you stop apologizing for your gifts, everything changes. Because here's the truth, the world won't always recognize your greatness at first. But that doesn't mean it isn't there. The question is, when your moment comes, will you be ready to step up?